back to another episode of Global Forum. One of our reflections is about societies and scholars. What happens in social settings, how scholars study them, and what do they find and how do they find them, and how other people can benefit from their findings. These are some of the issues we'll be discussing with our colleagues here today, American Muslims in the American mainstream. From a scholarly perspective, we have invited two distinguished individuals. First, we have here Professor Peter Skerry. He is a professor of political science at Boston College. He is also an author of a forthcoming book on Muslims in America. Next, we have Professor Suleyman Nyang, who is a professor of political science and African studies at Harvard University, author of numerous articles and books. Welcome to both of you.
Welcome, thank you.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about the relationship between a scholar and a society, particularly if the scholar happens to be a member of that society. What kind of vantage points does a scholar bring to that study?
Well, a scholar has several advantages over the ordinary person in looking at a society. First of all, by being a member of a society, at age 3 and beyond, you master the language of that culture. So naturally, you gain access and privileges to some of the secrets of the society by virtue of language competence. Secondly, a scholar is someone who has spent a great deal of time trying to master the standard knowledge of that culture in the form of books, articles, etc. So that gives him advantage in terms of a more sophisticated understanding of the culture. Then thirdly, the scholar also develops command of language to the point that he can edit himself when he makes grammatical errors, which the ordinary person may not be able to do. And then secondly, the scholar in the realm of language is also given the capacity to imagine and to come up with new concepts and new ideas. So when a scholar therefore looks at a society, he can bring to the society a bad eye view. He can look from above in the way most people will operate like lizards on the ground. And some of them may be able to gain height to see beyond the ground, but they may not be able to understand. Now there are limitations, of course, of the scholar. The scholar is also wedded to his society or her society. So the prejudices and the emotions of the society cannot be completely taken off from the scholar. So that's the difference. That's why a local scholar, as opposed to an outside scholar, the outside scholar is marginal to the society, and he can see things which the local scholar could see but may avoid to talk about because of emotionalism. So I think
Professor Skerry, capacity to imagination, capacity to imagine, and what else?
Well, I agree with everything that Professor Nyang just said, but I'm struck that when I'm trying to do research, whether it's about Muslims in America or other groups, that bird's eye view can also be a limitation, and that I find myself trying to understand, to use a phrase I used a few minutes ago, from the ground up, and that trying to avoid simply maintaining that bird's eye view. In my experience today, at least in the American Academy, that bird's eye view can be very limiting. Scholars tend to talk to scholars. They tend to be very isolated, very specialized, and some of that can be an advantage, but it can also be a limitation. So I find myself trying to overcome much of what you were just saying. It can be helpful. It can be up to a point, but it also has to be counterbalanced, I think, by an effort to try to understand the world or the context in which Muslims find themselves in America. Try to understand it from their perspective. Now, obviously, as an outsider, there's limitations on how I can do that, but I think up to a point, that's what I must try to do also.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you raised the point in terms of that contrast between the bird's eye view, which tends to be the preoccupation of the academic, because we have in America, we have all kinds of negative terms for the intellectuals and the people who use their head, the egghead, or people in the ivory tower.
Right.
But I think in since World War II, really, there has been an effort on the part of many American scholars, especially from the left, to try to do people's history.
Yes.
Try to understand history at the ground level, to mix with the common people, do interviews, learn from them, start with what they know and build on what they have.
Right.
Now I think in studying the Muslim community today, this new perspective, this new understanding could be helpful. You can have the bird's eye view, both by the insider and the outsider, who benefit from that fruit of scholarship. But at the same time, if you have people-to-people kind of study and people going on the ground, you do anthropological studies of the Muslims, and you go to the masajids and you talk to the people, you learn about the biographies of individuals, you might very well be in a position to produce solid works of scholarship that are radically different from the people with the bird's eye view.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. That's what I'm trying to do. Although I don't do it out of a political commitment from the left or the right, and no one's accused me of being a person of the left lately. But I think that combination that you're talking about and trying to understand it from the people's perspective, if you want to use that terminology, is critical.
Professor Skerry, it seems to me in answering any question, one not always but often ends up answering some larger questions also. And this methodology that you have very briefly outlined, understanding things bottom up or ground up, is actually, among other things, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, a quest to answer the question of integration and assimilation, which again has its own anxiety rooted in American history of immigrant nation.
Right.
Help us understand from your scholarly point of view, what is the meaning of assimilation and integration?
Okay, well that's a good but difficult question.
No doubt.
Yeah. My own view is that these two terms, assimilation and integration, really mean the same thing. I think integration gets used, sometimes I use it myself, to avoid using the term assimilation, which has a very pejorative connotation for many people. My perspective is that immigrants in American history and today have and do assimilate into American society. But by assimilation or integration, I mean my reading of American history and contemporary America is that assimilation is a two-way process. That clearly America changes immigrants in many ways, but at the same time, it doesn't require, and it hasn't required, total change. Aspects of immigrant culture, immigrant institutions, often don't change, or they adapt and don't change in any fundamental sense. In other ways, in other contexts, clearly immigrants have to change much more fundamentally. Language is the most obvious thing, where immigrants tend to lose their native language and speak English. But in other ways, religiously, in terms of ethnic identity, there's much more of an accommodation, I would argue.
Could I just ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
There was a letter written to an editor in California in which an individual said, "You're asking me to assimilate."
Right.
What he didn't say, and I would like to say it just to clarify his comment, assimilation comes from assimilar, Latin term, which means to make similar. Make similar to whom?
Yes.
And he said, "I'm a brown man, I cannot become white." So there's a physical limitation to assimilation. I'm a Muslim, I'm not going to become something else.
Right.
So what is the meaning of assimilation there? Then let's look at the question. Now, it's not a simple choice between speaking or not speaking English. It's a choice between speaking English and or speaking other languages.
Yes.
So we now have multilingual polyglot Americans and we have monolingual Americans. And people are making those choices. And there's a question of bilingualism, particularly with reference to Latino Americans.
Right.
So it's a complex web of choices, not a simple web of choices.
Right.
But I think then it becomes a little more complicated when we go to somebody like a book called Who Are We? by the same person who had come up with the Clash of Civilizations, Samuel Huntington.
Yes.
Professor Huntington's book. Now he believes that to be an American is not only simply to abide by the laws and to pay your taxes and do your duty and then be free to make other choices. He believes it is also essentially to buy into what he calls Anglo-Protestant values.
Yes.
Will you say assimilation necessitates an essential buy-in to Anglo-Protestant values?
I think, I don't know whether it necessitates it, but I think it's what has typically been what assimilation has meant. I think America inevitably persuades and encourages immigrants to become more individualistic in their behavior and in their values. That often sets up tensions and creates problems for immigrants, but it also creates opportunities as they become more individualistic.
Professor Skerry and I want Professor Nyang to jump in also, but here is the difficulty then.
Yeah.
As we think of citizenship in the modern context as the modern and postmodern notion of citizenship, which was seen to be empty of any religious or ethnic content, Samuel Huntington has actually reinscribed it with both ethnic, which is Anglo, and religious with the Protestant context. So we are saying that postmodern citizenship actually is characterized by religious and ethnic features, which is very local, very parochial, and very narrow.
Yeah.
So that creates all kinds of new problems on this issue, number one. And secondly, for instance, what about Anglo-Catholic?
Right.
After all, there's 69 million, I think the single largest church in the United States is Anglo-Catholic, not Anglo-Protestant, as a single church. So we have a discernible majority standing outside of that from the same faith.
Yeah.
And the same racial background standing outside of that. So therefore the question is that any choice that is made outside of that by definition has to be wrong. Okay, for instance, the gay and choice lifestyle stands outside of that. All right?
Stands outside
of the Anglo-Protestant, Anglo-Catholic church.
Why does it stand outside it?
Because those are not the traditional values that sort of enabled it. It is something that has evolved in contradistinction to them. The core that is defined by, in historical terms, by Samuel Huntington is that if we go to the traditional Christian view, it's outside of that. It's only non-traditional view of Christianity that will allow for modern lifestyle. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very fundamental issue that we have to deal with. I mean, I deal with integration and assimilation in two ways. I think in the American context, there was a desperate attempt after the Scandinavian. Gunnar Myrdal did that study.
Asian drama.
The American dilemma, where they tried to grapple with the question of race. I think one thing that most of us in the United States have not been very brave and courageous to deal with regard to the evolution of the American identity. In fact, there is a mythology among many of our intellectuals in America to believe that there is one standard American identity that has remained constant without a rainfall in that environment since the founding fathers, which is a myth. It's not true. I mean, if you look at the history of the United States, America has gone through 3 revolutions. The first one was violent, but the subsequent ones came as a result of either internal crisis in the American Republic or, in the case of the Civil War, or depression. If you look at the evolution of American society with regard to integration and assimilation, what you have to recognize is that at the time the founding fathers met in Philadelphia, coming from 13 colonies, 94 to 96% of the Americans were really white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the British Isles, mainly English, with some Scotsmen, few Irish. But by the time, that was why the West identity was real, because you have the numbers to back it up, you have the language to back it up. In fact, many of the Scandinavians, there's a famous passage written by a Scandinavian ambassador who visited the Scandinavians living in the Delaware Valley area, lamenting the fact that the Scandinavians were losing their language to English. because they were being Anglo-Saxonized in colonial America before the Revolution. Now what has happened is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant became the order of the day. It was supported racially, even though you have African Americans who are here, but they were not citizens. You have Native Americans who are not citizens. So the American identity was limited exclusively to white males. The white woman would become American citizen.
That's fine. Before we go too far into the history, the question therefore is, given the view of history, Professor Nyang and Professor Skerry, what is the concept of modern American citizenship against which we can judge assimilation or lack thereof? Because I think both things have to be defined. The criteria around which we're judging it, and the process through which one may or may not achieve that outcome. So that's why I'm asking both of you to help me understand what is the notion of American citizenship, what is the demand on the immigrant today, and you said something very specific, there's the knowledge of English language. I'll add to that abiding and complying with the laws, paying the taxes, doing the right thing, but beyond that, what is the notion of assimilation?
Well, I mean, to get away from the historical perspective, which is important, and Samuel Huntington, who and which is I think a can of worms we could talk about, but I could put it much more simply, I think, in the contemporary context. I think to the man on the street in America, ordinary Americans, assimilation basically means that immigrants don't make any particular demands on the rest of society, that they just sort of
blend in?
Don't make any waves. No, I don't think blend in. I think before 9/11, Muslims in America were assimilating as far as most Americans were concerned. They were just not there. They didn't pose any challenge. They didn't pose any problems. They were very different from, say, Mexicans and Hispanics, who to the man on the street weren't assimilating because they were putting demands on the rest of society. They wanted bilingual education. They posed challenges in schools. They posed challenges at the balloting booth. It's not a definition that I share, but I think that's the conventional common sense view of assimilation.
Professor Skerry, shouldn't it be challenging given the circumstances that we've entered into in 21st century, not necessarily from a Muslim point of view, but from many different minority and majority points of view. For instance, the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, on August 11, 1947, said democracy is a system in which a numerical minority can have an equal chance of becoming a political majority. So any demand of assimilation has to be consistent with our understanding of how a democratic system works. The demand for assimilation cannot be contradicting and undermining the democratic promise.
Right.
That is the right of minorities within the society. If in the society, majority is going to make a number of demands on a minority, then by that social contract, it has to be obliged to accept some demands in reverse order also. So the whole notion of absolute majoritarianism was that majority can do anything to minority. But that was rejected in this country.
Yes.
And the whole constitution was designed as saying certain things cannot be done either to minority or to individual. And therefore the whole notion of limitation in the constitution. So given that framework where there is a democratic obligation of groups to negotiate, to compromise, to understand, to give and take, and there is an existential demand of people learning from each other. For instance, yoga becoming very popular in this country, vegetarianism, sort of, resource management, being a little more conservative thing. These are elements from each other. So it is unnatural for any majority to think that it has become free and exonerated from learning from any other minority. And because learning has to be a two-way street always. It cannot be one-way street. No group can claim that they know everything for all the time. Every group has to learn from each other. Given that existential factor and given the fact that the democratic promise is promise of negotiation, different kinds of coalitions and compromise, how do we understand the notion of assimilation then?
Well, I have to think about that for a second. I mean, I guess I would say that I think immigrants in American history and today have very high degree of space in which they can create, build, and enjoy their own institutions. I mean, I think behind your question, I may be misinterpreting it, but I think behind your question is that despite our governmental structure, which is built on strong notions of minority rights, that's counterposed to the notion of assimilation, and that...
No, I'm just saying because, you see,
okay.
as Agha Saeed had said one time, we are not one but many Americas.
That's for sure.
And I think American Academy is consistent of my definition of assimilation.
Yeah.
To a minute for discussion, I want to know your definition of assimilation. So we can build up a discussion on that, but I think what you said is good enough.
Okay.
In the sense that this is, the notion of space is very good. I think the notion of space is very good. And
it's actually critical in America, I think.
Yes.
Space, I mean physical space, yes.
But I'm talking about cultural space also.
Okay.
And I look at a country and its capacity, its cultural maturity and sophistication in terms of the amount of space it's willing to provide to different groups, not only minorities, ethnic minorities, but ideological minorities, conceptual minorities to coexist in that space. And now the question is, Professor Nyang, is the cultural space in America at the beginning of 20th century shrinking or expanding?
No, I think the cultural space, actually what I call islandization process has taken place. What has happened really is that this is the great irony of the technological revolution. The technological revolution has given rise to islandization. There was an attempt at continentalization of the American cultural space so that you have a big continent of ideas, so that people were living in this expanding English-speaking world. But with the coming of the Hispanics, we're beginning to witness islandization. That whole continent is being islandized. But the islandization process is made possible by the fact that people are able to move bilingually from one cultural space to the other, something that did not exist before, because there was this ethnic, racial, or linguistic hegemon. So you have to fit in, and that was one of the reasons why America went through the second revolution I was alluding to after the Civil War, because the Irish Americans, the German Americans were excluded, even though they were white and they were Protestant in the case of some of the Germans, but they were excluded from full American citizenship. It's a fact of history. So after the Civil War, going towards Post-World War, World War I, many of these groups became assimilated into a new concept of whiteness in America. So that replaced the white Anglo-Saxon concept to the point that all of a sudden the Italians, the Germans, the Russians, and all the others who normally would have been excluded from the definition of who is an American by virtue of the last definition became embraced. So now what is happening is with the Hispanics, with the Muslims, the Buddhists, and all these other groups, America has now entered a third phase in terms of its self-conception, that you have space for many groups, to the point that they are very much like, metaphorically, the airwaves. You have many channels that exist, and you can listen to different channels. But sometimes there's an overriding channel that connects all of them together. So the old continentalization, which was based on physical space or linguistic space, is being now islandized to the point that people are connected, and that's why we have this big debate about languages. Now, whether we should be English or are we going to go the Canadian way to have these Hispanics as the moral, political, psychological counterpart of the French speakers.
Let's Professor Nyang, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think I see it kind of differently. I mean, first of all, I think today there is, I think this is agreeing with you, that there is more space for different cultures and different groups. But I don't think it's so enormously different from the past. I think we've long had the possibility of separate subcultures. And the notion of islands, I don't think I like, because an island is too isolated. I like the metaphor that the historian Arthur Mann, who was at the University of Chicago for many years, talked about. That we have groups with boundaries but they're sort of permeable boundaries. They're sort of groups that are surrounded by, without fences, as you put it. There's cores, and then people could stay with that core or they could leave it rather easily. I think it's more, in some ways it's easier to leave one's group today, but in some ways it's harder too. But I still think the basic dynamic is that there are kind of centers that people can attach themselves to or leave. And I think that there's enormous possibility for different groups and cultures in the United States today. Muslims tell me that all the time. Muslims tell me that they have more religious liberty here than just about any place else in the world, often more than the countries that they came from. And that's one of the things they like about America. They don't like lots of other things about America. Don't misunderstand me. And I think America, in that sense, is a very open society. I think the price of that openness is indifference. I personally don't think America is a very racist or discriminatory society. There are racists and there's elements of discrimination. But I think compared to most societies, we are enormously open and non-racist. But what we are is incredibly indifferent to what's going on beyond America.
Okay, let me say, first of all, we are three Americans talking about our country, America. America is not only a good country, it's a great country. Yet even a great country needs critical analysis and self-understanding and refinement.
For sure.
And given the fact that we are subject to so many changes in such short order of time, the demography of the United States, particularly states like California, the largest state, is changing rapidly.
Yes.
In about 25 years, there will be more Latino Americans than in the community in that state.
Right.
So the question here is the social contract drawn up at one stage in the life of a nation. Is it perpetual and permanent, or are there going to be provisions for renegotiation and adjustment? For instance, in case of California, where Latino Americans may become a majority soon, and therefore may want to have bilingualism. That's a real possibility. But the second question that enters the picture in that scene is the issue of a relationship among different groups. And I may be member of a minority at one level, I may be member of a majority level. For instance, if I'm a Democrat, I may be member of a larger party than opposed to somebody who's a Republican, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the issues that has come up is that in post-honor societies, equality has been accepted as a given for all human beings. But equality has not been accepted as a given for all social groups. Right? How do we negotiate that difficulty? Where we recognize, I recognize you, you recognize me, we recognize Professor Nyang as equals as human beings, individual groups to which we belong in different capacities. We don't recognize the equality of those groups. What kind of difficulty does it pose?
It poses enormous difficulties. Because in my view, not all groups are equal. I mean, they have different capacities, and we haven't worked out a way to reconcile our notions of equality with the realities of group differences. I don't have a solution for that. I mean, I can tell you what the attempted solutions are. The obvious one is that we deny what I just said. We assert that all groups are equal. And when groups perform differentially, that must be because they're being discriminated against, that there's something keeping one group down relative to another group. I'm not usually persuaded by those kinds of arguments because I believe different groups have different histories, they have different cultures, and they do experience different levels of opportunity. There's no doubt, but it's a very complicated story.
Professor Skerry, I'll bring you in just 1 second. Let's introduce here the notion of religion as one denominator of the category of racial or group identification. Under President Bush, where there has been faith-based initiatives, a lot of money given to these groups.
Yes.
He being the first president to open up the treasury to these kinds of things.
Yes.
Do you think he has used, or his administration has used, an equitable criteria for adjudicating these funds? on the choices of religion, and can we predict which religion got the sort of a preference? And can any society in some kind of objective manner prove the superiority of one religion over the other in having allocated the resources in the manner they were allocated? So, to the extent that a modern society is a rational society, it's a secular society, separation of church and state, on what basis can we justify that allocation of resources, which comes from everybody fronting money?
With regard to religion specifically?
It's shaped with initiatives where, people are giving money to churches and other institutions on the basis of religion and saying, this religious group is better than others, therefore he gets more money, they get more money than the other, because the religion is better than the other. That's the underlying argument.
Well, I'm not sure I accept that. I don't think that's the underlying argument. I think that the underlying argument is that the major religions in America are equivalent.
Majority religions. There's a difference between saying major religion and majority religion.
No, major. By specifically, I mean Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam. In terms of the ideology of America,
okay,
that those are to be viewed as equivalent. Now, I don't know the evidence as well as I'd like to, but it's my impression, if this is what you're driving at, that when it comes to the faith-based initiative, that Islamic institutions and Muslims didn't receive equivalent funding.
Yes, that's my submission.
Yeah.
For the review. You're a scholar in this area, you will look it up.
Yeah.
But we can see even in New York, the religious groups were given money when the state did not believe there has to be any funding of religious institution by public treasury. And that, of course, was not Muslim groups that were given the money, but some other groups. So the question therefore becomes, Professor Nyang, how do you understand the great promise of America, its separation of church and state, its promise of being a rational society, a postmodern citizenship, a notion where neither your ethnicity, nor your race, nor your religion, anything disqualifies you or qualifies you except your own conduct and character. And suddenly one is beholden to so many different labels and different impediments to one's performance in a society as an equal citizen.
Well, this is the persistence of ideology in the modern context, because I think if we go back to that whole tradition, I think the old Napoleonic statement to the Jews is being revoked here, because Napoleon told the Jews that we are going to judge you not as a group, but as individuals. It was a major turning point towards modernity. But of course, the revival of old tribalism, religious or ethnic tribalism, has come back to haunt us in America, because there is no scientific basis for you to say this religion, by virtue of numbers, is superior in terms of its cosmology to any other religion. There's no way you can prove that. Science certainly will not be on the side of anyone who makes that kind of point argument in modern America. But what has happened really is, when we talk about groups, and this dichotomy between individual rights and individual acceptance in terms of integrity, performance, etc., as opposed to groups' rights and counter-group rights, is the question of power and history. See, I think power and history are the primary reasons for that division between groups. So what will be at the individual level equal is made disproportionate, unequal at the group level, because when it comes to power, you're going to have differentiations and you're going to have polarization between powerless and powerful. You see that in Europe, between the royal families that lost power to the revolutionary groups. So you have completely new arrangements, new social formation, new organization. So in the American context, what President Bush did might very well turn around and create a lot of problems, because what will happen is, so long as some of the groups that are benefiting now maintain some kind of control, the moment the electoral votes begin to go the other way, and some other groups that were opposed to this dispensation, this agreement, takes power, you'll have a complete reversal of the old game. And so, I mean, that is the way power is. So, what would be beneficial to one individual minister, because he comes from the quote-unquote right church, he may find out that down the road, 10 years from now, he may be a great loser, because power moves to the other side. So, and I think that's the problem we face with regard to power distribution.
I don't know that I'd reduce an explanation of all outcomes to simply to power influence, but because I think certainly in America notions of rights and justice also play some role, but I wouldn't basically disagree with your position that power and influence are critical here.
We'll agree with both of you. Both of those are excellent points. But let's continue that after a short break. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back. All right, Professor Nyang, we have talked about many aspects of abstract notion of citizenship, assimilation, integration, debates about equality of individuals, debates about equality of groups, and so on and so forth. I think that sets up a framework, but let's now go to concrete issues. Let's look at the notion of the mosque in the suburbia of America. Okay, located the mosque on the suburban setting of America, and then tell us what are the changes that are taking place in the mosque, outside the mosque, and the interaction between the mosque and the environment.
Yeah, I think when we look at the concrete here, sociologically, we notice that one of the good evidence of the Muslim presence in America is the existence of what we call suburban masjid or inner city masjid. But overwhelmingly, the majority of the masajids are in the suburbs because it reflects the socio-economic development of the immigrant Muslim presence. And these immigrant Muslims have really created some kind of a toehold on the American cultural landscape. And this is very much captured in terms of architecture, that you have domes, things that were not visible in America 30, 40 years ago in any significant ways. Now, if you travel throughout urban America, you will notice that in the suburbs, you have a large number of these, in the thousands now, around the country, in varying degrees. Some are very elegant, very developed, Asian, Jewish, and their Christian counterparts. And of course, you have a number of human beings who assimilate, who assemble in these quarters, on Sundays and Saturdays, and almost every day, depending on the number of people they have in their area.
Don't forget Fridays.
Huh?
Don't forget Fridays.
Fridays are very critical, because Friday is the critical Jummah prayer. In fact, that's one of the very important day in the week, because that's the day of, articulation of the faith in a big way among the Muslims. So you do have the politics of numbers with regards to Muslims coming together and somehow amplifying and magnifying their presence in the suburbs. Secondly, the architectural design and the architectural presence is not only supported demographically, but it is also supported in terms of culinary practices. All of a sudden, the Muslim immigrants now begin to buy and sell food that are really exports from their original homeland. So one way of studying the, food habits of Muslims and the whole question of halal meat and all that is to begin to look at the suburban masjid. And the other thing I would like to raise is the fact that as a result of these Islamic centers or masajids, because the Muslims have created a new concept, Islamic center, which is new to America, not strange to some of the Muslim countries. They have mosques. They don't have Islamic center. The Islamic center is much larger concept than the masjid, because the Islamic center...
Please explain what's the difference.
Yeah, the masjid is basically a place of worship, and you find its counterparts throughout the Muslim world. And the parallel between the masjid in the Muslim world and the masjid over here is that they have the common feature of being the praying place for Muslims. And of course, the Islamic center therefore is bigger in the sense that the Islamic center is not only a place where you can go for prayers, Friday prayers or Eid prayers or daily prayers, but this one has multi-purpose function. You can have weddings, and many of the events that are taking place in the Islamic centers in urban America are not really taking place in the Muslim world, because the Muslims have alternative sites for those marriages and other events.
Professor Skerry, you've also been studying the mosque and its landscape and its environment. What have you observed?
Well, I've observed much of what Professor Nyang has just described. I would add to it that the multifunction aspect of the Islamic Center in the American context creates lots of opportunities and new challenges for Muslims. One of the challenges is that the imam has responsibilities that imams are not used to having. And since most of the imams in the United States are foreign-born, many of them come here and find themselves charged or burdened with tasks that they're not used to performing, in many cases don't want to perform.
Such as?
Well, having to hire somebody to put a new roof on the mosque, or having somebody to deal with the grounds around the mosque, or having to deal...
Professor Skerry, that sounds like an imam is somehow a deficient human being who cannot perform a normal task of hiring somebody to put up a roof or do something. Now, New York Times said the Muslims, and that's an article looking for an American imam in the New York Times, they said American congregation expects an imam to be able to advise them on investing their 401k pension funds.
Yeah.
I have never met a Muslim who expected that or who in the Muslim community, but I don't want to challenge the absolute authority of the New York Times on such a matter. However, I do want to ask, what do you think are the difficulties other than hiring people? Because normally hiring is not done by the imam, it's done by the president of the mosque, which is
right. But just to clarify, I wasn't impugning the abilities of an imam, but like any professional, anyone who has any notion of what it is they're trained to do, they don't like to do things that they're not trained to do, and that violate their expectations. So that's not impugning imams. It's merely saying that they find themselves in a situation where they're being asked or called upon to do things that in their experience is not what imams do.
Okay, so they are being asked to do things outside of their normal function.
Yeah.
Okay, and that creates difficulties.
Sure. But I guess the other side of this, I mean, if the more positive side of it, I think, is that these Islamic centers in the United States, I think, are good examples of a kind of Tocquevillian dynamic of Americans building their own institutions and learning the lessons that people learn when they build their own institutions, lessons in democracy, lessons in how to deal with the functioning of an organization, and that's what Muslims tell me, and that's what I see in mosques and Islamic centers in America. I think that's a very encouraging and positive development.
Yes, no, I agree with you. My own hope was, I was thinking that perhaps you are both of you going to lead us to say that most foreign-born imams confront in this country a diversity of congregation among the congregation they never experienced in their home countries, because they are coming from Syria or Pakistan or Sudan or wherever,
right,
where they have a defined set of, not necessarily homogeneous, but defined set of sort of ethnicities within that context.
Stable
set of context. And here you have suddenly a community that is so diverse, that is more than 100 countries in the world represented there together. So there is a question of internal diversity that is visited for the first time. But Professor Nyang, tell us about the 4 different classifications you have done of the masajid and who leads them, and then connected that to issue of diversity, please.
Yeah, I think, when we talk about the masajids, we have to recognize the fact that the whole phenomenon of the imported imam becomes something that is parallel to the Jewish and the Catholic experience. In the sense that as the Muslims start to negotiate their way into American modernity, they have to come up with people who are fluent and articulate locally, to the point that they don't carry the disabilities of being a foreign imam. Now, what is very interesting with regard to the sociology of the masajids, I tend to identify the different kinds of masajids we have. We have the Amir masajid, that is a masajid that is headed by someone who is like he's the prince or the leader of the community. He's a charismatic figure, a charismatic imam. Siraj Wahaj comes to light as one particular person who exercised tremendous influence over his congregation, and he is the leader of the community. And there are many other parallels to that. Secondly, we have the board of directors. These are Muslims who have created Islamic centers very much model like corporate America. And you have That's why Dr. Agha Saeed was correct in suggesting that you have instances where, when it comes to fixing the roof, that is not the job of an imam, it's the job of the president of the board of directors, because they pay the bill. And the imam is really a civil servant, so to speak, or somebody who is hired to do the bidding of the board of directors. So when you have that kind of situation, their role and their leadership positions are very different from the amir, because they operate like corporate America, and you have a president, and you have secretary, etc. And the imam really is subsidiary to them. Then you have a third group, the surah, the Quranic word, surah that you work in. Consultation. So you have a group of Muslim families, maybe 50, 100 or more, who come together and they build a mosque. And then, of course, they have someone who is identified as distinguished in terms of his scholarship. He becomes the imam by virtue of his knowledge of the religion. Now, he's different from the imported imam who was brought in by the board of directors of a particular mosque to cater to a number of interests, prayer leadership, speaking in the local tongue understood by the founding fathers who are the fourth generation immigrants. This imam is appointed by the community through consensus, and he is not an amir like the first person who becomes the supreme leader of the group and he has his followers like a charismatic leader.
Right.
So you have this third model. Then you have what I call the satellite masjids. The satellite masjids are various masajid that are established by people who are identified with the major international people who identify with ISNA, ICNA, and all the other groups. So they become satellite masjids. They have an imam, but he's part of a larger organization, and then they are affiliated to ICNA or ISNA. So when he governs, he's not an amir, nor he is the president of a university, of a board of directors, nor is he a member of a founding group that is not affiliated to a state or national organization. So these are the four categories that we have with regards to administrative organization.
Now let's hold the thought right there. I'll listen to you 1 second. I think partly the dynamics of interaction, whether it is through mainstream media or mainstream academia, including both of you, or other sources of community dialogue, intra-community dialogue, is the notion of the role of the imam in the masajid, whether it is foreign-born, foreign-educated, or domestic-born, domestic-educated, or domestic-born, foreign-educated. Those are only variations. I think underlying issue is the interpretation of the Quran. What interpretation of the Quran are made available? So to use contemporary terms, it's the whole notion of politics of interpretation. How Quran has to be interpreted in America and understood by Muslims in today's situation. How do you see that politics of interpretation playing out? The politics of interpretation in the masjid and the demands and the exchange about that politics in the mainstream media and the mainstream academia.
That's a big and complicated question, I think. I think I would say, I'd be very curious to hear what Professor Nyang, how he sees this, but I would say that this is it's very contested terrain in all of those dimensions. And that within a mosque, within mosques in America, that partly because imams often are hired by boards, as you suggested, not always, but often, and the boards themselves are often not unified. I think this is where the corporate model, the way you described it, I think would be a little misleading. Corporate boards can also be divided, but I think are much more governed by consensus in the sense that that's how they typically operate. My reading of mosque boards is that they're often very contentious kinds of environments where whether it's questions of interpreting the Quran or interpreting Islam more generally are heavily contested and argued and fought out, often masked by political differences ideological differences or overlaid by them, as well as personality conflicts. So that I guess I would say that it's a multi-tiered kind of battle, multi-tiered contest. And if we're talking about the mosque, I think it's an extremely contentious one. But Professor Nyang, I'd be curious to hear your view.
Yes, no, I think if you look at this whole, the politics of the masajid, the politics of the masajid is very complex because you have contending levels of articulation. You see, you have the attempt on the part of the leadership to create some kind of a replica of what they know at home. That's why the myth of the imported imam becomes very crucial for some of them, because the imported imam is useful in terms of preserving the memories of the fourth generation, but they are antithetical to the assimilation, we talk about assimilation, integration, to the Americanizing experiences of the younger generation.
Let me stop you there. Aren't we then giving the imam too much power over the life of the individual?
Well,
hang on a second. I think for the reason, Professor Nyang, for every one individual who goes to mosque, there are at least 4 who don't. When we talk intergenerationally, then we are extending the presumed influence of the imam way beyond what is empirically verifiable, number one. Number two, imam is one source of influence, but not the only source of influence in the life of any individual. And number three, look at the models of assimilation people are doing. And I think one of the best one was in New York Times, a woman who wears hijab and is a first-aid high-tech professional. All right. So people who are arriving into the post-modern era with their identity intact, and people who are trying to check their hijab at the door or sort of their identity at the door, there are 2 different models that are here. And they cannot be simply assigned to imam. The post-9/11 gaze and pressure on American Muslims may account more for people clinging back to their faith than the role of any set of imams put together.
No, this is true. I think the role of the imam could be exaggerated by the immigrant elements who want to maintain their memories through his presence. However, the imam himself is on the defensive because he's being challenged at various levels, like in terms of professional criterion and professional affirmativeness. The imam is challenged in terms of language competency.
Yes, very much.
So that becomes very critical in terms of the imam. The imam is also questioned in terms of familiarity with modern scientific knowledge and relevance in terms of his khutbahs to the daily needs of the members of the constituency. The imam is also on a psychological defensive because he's supposed to be a role model, but he cannot measure up fully as a role model if he doesn't have the wherewithal, and if his status is defined as in the case of the corporate model, or if he finds himself as an amir, but he doesn't have the wherewithal to really back his words with deeds. That happens to the charismatic leader. The Russianization of charisma, a la Weber. To what extent can you Russianize charisma to the point that you have institutional support on behalf of your leadership? So there are a number of things about the imams.
What about the intrusive forces operating in and around the mosque now? And by intrusive I don't mean only FBI, though I definitely mean FBI. I mean other kinds of groups, like the group recently said they will go and visit every mosque and see whether or not they talk about the Sharia law, and if they talk about the Sharia law, they'll report them to such and such authorities. So now there is a number of mainstream media entities have gone into major mosques, and they have attacked the imam, they've attacked the khutbah, they've attacked the congregation, they've tried to intimidate the people. I'm not talking about the sort of tabloid press. I'm talking about mainstream major newspapers.
Well, yeah, the thing is this. I think the imam faces a number of obstacles as a result of 9/11, and the involvement of some of the groups that have been system challenges to Muslims, and especially the imam, because the imam is identified as the fall guy for the community of Muslims, because those who are desperately looking for targets within the community can find the imam as the most visible target. So naturally the imam is visible on a number of fronts. First of all, He's the only member of the community who has access to the bully pulpit. In this case, the member. He can come and he talks to the community in their life. So naturally, because he has access to this big magnifying mirror, he becomes the fall guy, the one you can really tape, because he can speak loudly and you can get his voice without his knowledge, because he's speaking over a microphone. Second thing that makes the imam vulnerable in the sense that the imam is now being...
Hang on. Is it only the imam who's being made vulnerable or the person who's going there to pray? I'm asking you for your assessment of the community situation. Keep in mind, not in one but many places, particularly in Orlando, Florida, man coming out of the mosque, in the parking lot of the mosque, or the pro-human FBI official, and he said, what did you pray about today? What was your prayer?
There was an FBI official?
When you can inquire into the conversation between a person and his God or her God, that transcends any notion of privacy, democracy, that is essential fascism. So the question here is, this is what Bertram Gross in his book Friendly Fascism has called, the efficacy of this fascism is it is so selective. It's only applied to a small percentage of the 2% of the population. So what I'm asking is, what are the environment in which the mosque is operating right now? The last, because we are running out of time, so please summarize your answer and I'll ask a question.
Yeah, well, I think, the mosque under this kind of situation really is a masajid under surveillance. So if you're talking about a masajid under surveillance, then of course that masajid is in a quadruple whammy situation. Not triple whammy, but quadruple whammy. One is the fact that from a democratic point of view, whatever you say, loudly or in silence, with God, is supposed to be protected by the Fourth Amendment rights of the American. Secondly, you are vulnerable with regard to the politics of fear, because whenever you have a fascist or autocratic regime that interferes at the political level, they create this politics of tyranny. And of course, you threaten people, so people are even afraid of talking. So if you control people's thoughts, and you control their speech and their action, you control them at 3 levels of operation. And that's very dangerous in terms of any democratic society.
Is that what's going on now?
Well, that's the perception that has, true, real or imagined. But if that perception is accepted by some...
Well, let's look at that, for instance, in one of the 50 states. And I'll just not mention the state because I want to protect the people in case. There was a masjid that was invited to attend an FBI-sponsored meeting. They didn't go. They were invited again. They didn't go. They invited again. They didn't go. 4 times and 5th time. They felt intimidated. They had to go. So this was a meeting supposed to be where the FBI was going to find out from them if there are any problems. And they didn't want to go, but they were forced to come. When every single imam is sort of, almost obliged to come there in time, in terms of issues of surveillance by command posed as friendship and community affairs, that's intimidation. There is a mosque in California at the Fremont Avenue and the Winter Avenue corner where the cameras installed. Everybody who goes in there is photographed. I talked about it. Senator Murphy brought up in the issue in the whole thing. FBI said was not their cameras, and I said, whose cameras are these? And they said, the FBI spokeswoman said, we are sorry, people are paranoid. I said, there was no camera, and we imagine there is one that will be paranoia. If there's a camera that can be seen by everybody, it's there, there's only common sense to say whose camera this device is installed. So when you have masajid in the United States where invisible forces install cameras to photograph everybody coming in and going out, the question is, it is freedom of worship provided to people in America, but only selectively. Some people have it, others don't.
Can I interject here?
Please.
I guess I object to the picture you're creating.
We invited you to object. You have the right to. Please go ahead and tell us why.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that these are difficult times in America for Muslims. I wouldn't, given the current context, want to trade place with a Muslim. Okay. But having said that, I think you exaggerate and you paint an overly lurid picture. You imply that most mosques in the United States, or large numbers of mosques, are under the surveillance of FBI cameras. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I don't doubt for a minute that large numbers of mosques are under surveillance by the FBI. But it's also the case that the FBI, was at the conference this weekend, the ICNA conference that we all attended. And the scenario you depict of FBI inviting an imam to come in and repeatedly suggesting they come in, there is some element of fear that might be introduced there, but there's also a significant dynamic whereby the FBI is struggling while surveilling Muslims to build up friendly relations with them not for altruistic reasons, but because they're encouraged to do that while they're also encouraged to surveil Muslims. And Muslims and Muslim organizations want to develop those relationships. So it's a complicated dynamic.
No, hang on. It's not that complicated in relation to some rules. The whole notion of group punishment is a fascist tradition, and the Geneva Convention forbid it. No one community can be punished for the crimes of few by putting the whole 7 million people. The number exceeds the total population of many middle-sized countries in the world. When a state takes upon itself to surveil an entire community for the perceived victims of few, then it is actually not engaging either a democratic or a rule-governed or a constitutional behavior. It is extra-constitutional behavior which may suit you at this time for the reasons you stated earlier, being penetrating the position, but it cannot be seen from the perspective of people on the receiving end as something that is consistent with democratic ideals.
Why is it extra-constitutional?
Because
has the Constitution suddenly been declared null and void? I'm not aware of that.
No, hang on. Two things, sir. Number one, if you had read the decision by Judge John Gleeson of the Federal Court of New York, given on June 14, 2006, which says any non-immigrants, which includes permanent residents, guest workers, seasonal workers, tourists and others, can be arrested solely on the basis of their religion, ethnicity or country of origin, held indefinitely without explanation.
Well, that's one federal judge's decision I haven't read.
Yes, it is.
But it's still just one federal judge
whose decision is now the ruling verdict, and David Cole has filed an petition against that, number one. Number two, when according to your own admission, FBI can look at the entire community to surveil it and to befriend it simultaneously. Anytime you look at all Muslims, all Jews, all Christians, any community in entirety, in relation to crime of a few, you are actually engaging in collective punishment. Right? That collective punishment.
I don't grant that.
Okay, let's agree to disagree. Okay. Collective surveillance is an element of collective punishment.
No, I'm not sure what collective surveillance means.
Collective surveillance means putting an entire community of 7 million under surveillance, collecting their names. For instance, in one of the counties, a Muslim had to go and get a document for a certain purpose. It was a lawsuit that he was involved in, and the person who was giving him the document said, by the way, we have been ordered by the FBI to collect every single case against any Muslim that we identify in the last 30, 40 years, compile it and give the separate information. My bag was stolen from my car but one time. I surprisingly got it back after 4 hours. I'm thankful for that, but it was not given back to me for 2 days. And one of the police officers in the office later on told me privately, he said, look, we have to photocopy everything because we are under order when a Muslim is implicated in any case, regardless of his victim or the victimizer, everything has to be photocopied and given to the FBI. In my case, it was only student papers, so I'm glad they have good time to sort of confirm my grading, whether it was valid or not. But the point here is that when we have the whole notion of FBI engaging in surveillance of 7 million Muslims, that action itself is unconstitutional and against the spirit of democracy. But I'd like to have the last word because we need to wrap up.
Well, I don't think 7 million Muslims are being surveilled. I don't think the FBI is capable of doing that. Is the Muslim community in America under particular scrutiny? Undeniably. Is that at the expense in specific cases of their rights? Undeniably. But is the entire Muslim community in America being deprived of its constitutional rights? I don't accept that.
All right, fair enough.
Okay.
This is a discussion to be continued.
Okay.
No, I think really what is happening is there is suddenly a common fear and threat in the American society as a result of 9/11 and the other developments. And I think we have to be very realistic about this. On the one hand, because of what happened, 9/11 was a great shocker. It was a great psychological transformation for Americans. It has a lot of consequences, which I don't think many Americans and many Muslims have really registered psychologically to appreciate what has happened to the country, because the amount of energy, the whole politics of fear that has developed not only in America but globally, and the fear that Americans never had before in their life. All of a sudden there's this group paranoia that has developed. It was not here before. Americans were very free people. They didn't have those kind of fears. So the reality that exists now is that the FBI, among many other agencies in the country, are put on the defensive because they now have to preempt. So that psychology of preempting any kind of negative action gives rise to this kind of situation we are living in. And it has all the implication of law and rights and duties, etc. So if you go to the masjid, Muslims may not be really under surveillance, but the fear makes the imagine real. And I think that's where we are, really. That's where we are.
And that's why I said I wouldn't trade places with a Muslim, because I think that fear is real. But one final point, it is rather striking that in the past year where we've had this intense debate over immigration in the United States, Americans have been calling into talk radio and in some cases demonstrating in the streets, not out of concern about Muslims and mosques, but out of concern about Mexican day laborers standing on the street corner. I don't derive any satisfaction from that, but I would argue that if Americans are riled up and fearful about any group in America today, it's Mexican laborer immigrants more than it is Muslims. They're concerned about both, but I think they're most riled up, perhaps unwisely. We could argue about that.
Skerry, again, we unfortunately don't have time, but if we look at the history of the United States, each time America became less tolerant of its minorities, it became less receptive to immigrants from outside the world, particularly black and brown people. 50s legislation, 65 legislation, 2001 legislation are living examples. There's a correlation between domestic civil liberties agenda and immigration policies. But let that be a discussion for another day.
Okay.
We had a very interesting discussion, 3 Americans talking about their country, how to look at the social settings, groups, conflicts, compromises, making better conditions. America at its best when it's able to sort out its difficulties through discussion, through understanding, through building bridges, through creating new possibilities, through inventiveness. So this was a discussion with 2 of my learned colleagues. We made it a little too academic today, for which I apologize to my audience, but it was all for the better cause of understanding not only arguments, but theories and concepts behind those arguments. Thank you very much.